Welcome everyone. I'm Jake Bryant. I'm a partner at McKinsey, where I lead our work in education technology. Feel like the frame of the panel might have attracted some of the few tech cynics at the conference, so hopefully you're here, you don't have to reveal yourselves. But I'm really excited to dig into this, both kind of what's been the promise of EdTech and what of that has it delivered, and then what has it not, and how do we sort of bend the trajectory upwards, kind of go forward. We have a really great set of panelists to that topic, and maybe I'll ask them to introduce themselves before we dive in.
Great.
Mark?
I'm Mark Angel. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Amira Learning, previously the Chief Technology Officer at Renaissance Learning.
Hey everybody, I'm Jamie Candee. I'm the CEO of Edmentum. We're a K-12 learning technology organization serving about 6 million students here in the US.
I'm Kent Pekel. I'm Superintendent of Schools in Rochester, Minnesota. We are the home of the Mayo Clinic, so we have a lot of the best doctors and scientists in the world, and also wonderful growing diversity in an urban area, and they pretty much all go to our schools.
Go Minnesota.
Yeah.
I'm Kristen Fox. I'm a managing director at Tyton Partners. We're a strategy consulting firm. We work with institutions, companies, foundations, and investors to grow impact and mission and in the education space, early childhood through workforce.
I'm Paul Leblanc. I'm a spokesperson for the new line of sneakers that I'm wearing, released by Southern New Hampshire University, where I'm also president.
So let's kind of go back before we go forward. Imagine we were on this panel, which several of us were 15 years ago. What were you hoping for from education technology, and where is that sort of delivered on your wildest dreams, and where are those dreams a little nightmarish in retrospect? Maybe Jamie, I'll start with you.
Oh boy, so 15 years ago I had transitioned out of classroom teaching, and we were doing this work, and we had just, if everybody remembers, the on-prem software, the CD-ROMs, the caching servers. That actually wasn't that long ago. And I think at that time, this idea that you would think of a teacher standing in the classroom with sort of their dashboard, right, and students working all over the room in different stations with differentiated instruction, and the power of technology, just thinking about how it can be the greatest teaching assistant that we could ever imagine, and giving teachers the power to serve every single student, not just teach towards the middle, but actually be able to differentiate instruction. And so I think your second part of that question is, are we there?
Or what were you, where are we on the hope, and then?
We still have a ways to go. I think, as we travel and see schools, and you've got schools like this, there are definitely teachers who are able to stand in front of the classroom with their dashboard and feel very comfortable differentiating instruction, but we still have a lot of opportunity. I think a big part of that is some of the equity challenges that we have in schools with communities that are very marginalized in terms of just access. And so one of the things that I'm excited about, COVID was hard, the pandemic was hard, but it has, for the most part, leveled the playing field in terms of providing access using stimulus to be able to purchase that infrastructure. And so now it's about, where are we? It's how do we continue to focus on educators and actually help them fully realize the promise of using technology as their very best teaching assistant.
Paul, I'd love your thought on the same question, kind of put yourself 15 years back, and how would you have imagined today, and then how does it compare?
So it's a depends question, right? So in some ways, it's remarkable what we are able to do today. We serve refugee populations in remote refugee camps in Africa, unthinkable 15 years ago, and that's only possible because of technology. And on the other hand, I'm struck by the ways in which our student data sits in silos that are hard to get a holistic view of our students. I think that we have made, when I think about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I'm old enough to go 30 years ago, that the promise was big system change, and then it dissolved into point solutions that became less interesting and less productive. So for the particular thing, they were helpful, but it didn't help you rethink the system. And I think today with AI, we're now sort of entering a phase again, like it was 20 and 25 years ago, where we now can fundamentally rethink the system. We're just beginning to understand the questions, not even the answers, the questions we start to get to ask.
Kristen, I'd love your riff on that, like on a point solution basis, incredible progress, plus access, which is this sort of base layer that enables it all. That's great. But can the technology itself enable the system change? Does the system have to change in order to harness the full benefit of the technology?
Yeah, so that's the issue, right? So Clay Christensen, everyone knows his work, a dear friend of 40 years, was on my board. And we would debate this quite frequently because the question about Clay's work is that it always assumed rational market forces, and it didn't really fully address the problem of a highly regulated industry. So we're like healthcare, and like healthcare, third-party payer, heavily regulated. You have to change the system to unleash the technology. Technology by itself can't change the system. And that's why I think it's fundamentally held things back. And I think the other piece of this, and this is a more recent revelation for me, is that for the populations that matter most to us, which I always say SNHU serves the 45% of Americans who would struggle to come up with $400 for an unexpected car repair. They are just one car repair from being knocked out of the box. So we had $100 million of CARES Act money during the pandemic. 65% of our requests for emergency aid was for food insecurity, followed by housing insecurity. You know what? Designing a greater learning experience is not fixing that. So for us, I think we have to get at broader, human, relationally centered questions, and I'm not sure that EdTech has actually cared that much about them. We'll spend enormous amounts of time talking about content and curriculum and delivery systems, but I don't know that we talk enough about the ways we have to center critical human relationships in the work and then use technology to scale the hell out of everything else.
Yeah, it does strike me, we don't talk about that much, but Kent, that's the main thing that you talk about. Would love to hear how you all are tackling how you are harnessing technology, and particular to that kind of building of relationships.
Yeah, if you'd asked me 15 years ago what I would have thought there would have been more change, I would have thought technology would have changed the instructional core more than it has. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Also concurrent with that, we've had the standards movement and the accountability movement, which really constrained a lot of innovation. Where I would be putting my eggs in a basket right now, and what we're doing in Rochester is technology as an enabler of human connection.
Right.
So high tech and high touch. And this may sound a little paradoxical, but we need to make those human connections more efficient because teachers want to have that kind of connection, but they're overwhelmed. So one of the things we piloted in Rochester over the last year is actually based on research that I led in my previous job before I went to Rochester, which was as president of a research organization called Search Institute, and we studied relationships, teacher, student, parent, child, and out-of-school time. And then Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and Gradient Learning built an app called Along that essentially automates, using videos between the teachers and the students, these sort of interactions and connections that the research showed are really developmentally beneficial for kids. And we piloted it in Rochester, and we just got really exciting pre-post increases in the degree to which kids felt known, seen, and validated by their teachers. What the teachers said was, this is the kind of stuff that I got into education to do, but I was able to send a short video out to my students, and then the students respond back with a video, and I could do it at 11 p.m. at night. And it was a quantum leap in the degree to which those teachers could quickly get connected to their kids. And just in this conference, I've encountered several other apps that I think are doing that sort of making the human connection less frictionful that I think is tremendously exciting.
Mark, I'd love your riff on this. So your product is chiefly a teaching and learning one to kind of core instruction, but then it invites this question of kind of how do you build these connections, how do you build these relationships alongside the learning?
Yeah, well, 15 years ago, I was coming out of a long period of working with Apple and on projects like Siri. And what we saw In the consumer space, when you look around the room, you see everyone with their iPads and their iPhones, is that it was relatively easy for technology to profoundly change the day-to-day experience of people. It's turned out, for all the reasons that have been talked about, that it's much tougher for EdTech. But look, I'm a technologist, and what I've seen over many, many years is that people tend to underestimate technology until the moment arrives when it finds its destiny in a particular place. We saw this with speech recognition. For years and years, speech recognition didn't work. We got to a tipping point. Now it's pretty ubiquitous in most of our day-to-day environment. I'm a believer that technology evolves generationally. You look at the phone, it's 5G networks. You look at aircraft fighter jets, it's the 5th generation. The truth is, EdTech is still early days in those generational shifts. At best, we're at the 3rd generation now. I believe that we're at the threshold where with AI, the tech can step into the kind of human dynamic and human dialogue that characterizes the educational process. So Amira is explicitly a teacher's assistant. Amira listens to students read out loud, and Amira is designed to kind of create a third voice in the harmony between the teacher and the student. So we're about to get there.
It does feel like we're kind of on the precipice of a next generation, hopefully. What's different? So we talked about, great progress on access, some amazing point solutions, real progress actually on kind of making efficient those uniquely human relationships a teacher has with his or her students and the students with each other, but not yet like outcomes at scale, personalization at scale with notable exceptions. What's sort of the arc of the trajectory of this 4th generation, and how much of that's unleashed by AI or what we have gotten at anyway? Kristen, I'd love you to start.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start by giving a story about what I was doing. I'm going to go back 20 years, not 15, but I was in graduate school here at the University of California, San Diego, and I was teaching an undergraduate course that was history and writing focused. So 300 students. Every February, side note, I wonder why I'm in Boston and not in San Diego anymore, but that's a topic of another panel. But 300 students, and I had no information about who they were, what experiences they were coming with, if they were 1st gen, if they had family responsibilities, if they were working. And I had office hours, and those students who knew how to navigate the system would come to me for help, and I would get to know them, and I would work with them. But I had no learner information about them, and that was hard, right? And it relied on them to take the initiative. So one of the things that I think has been an amazing evolution is that access to more data about the human that lets instructors, K-12 or in higher ed, intervene, support, et cetera, in ways that scale. Is something that I think has been very powerful, and to enable AI-assisted tools to influence that behavior as well. What I still see as an opportunity and a challenge is designing those in ways that really work with the humans that are using those tools, right? And so, as we, in the work that I do with institutions, with adopters of technology, the feedback is constantly, hard to use, not constant, with exceptions, but oftentimes, the user interface and design is challenging. It's hard for me to render that data and use it and take it to drive decisions around my instruction or where to intervene. And how do we make sure that we're co-designing with the different lived experiences of students and faculty or K-12 instructors in mind, and thinking about integration, to your point earlier, across systems so that we can get that whole view of the learner and really support and intervene at scale.
Paul, what is the SNU student experience of 2030 look like, different from today?
Thank you. There's a project that was called SNU 2030, but we thought that's going to take too long, so we called it SNU 2025, which is giving us a panicky sense of urgency. Before I answer that question, and it's related, can I comment something Kristen said, which I spent, this is the shameless book plug. I spent a year writing a book called Broken, which came out last fall, and I spent a year interviewing innovators in other scaled systems of care. So I've used that phrase to describe systems that seek to transform people's lives, and systems of care would be K-12, healthcare, mental health. I included criminal justice, though it doesn't even pretend anymore to try to do this, and then of course higher ed. And what was interesting about that is the lessons I learned in that was, to your point, Kristen, it was how do we identify the most important human relations. Because, do you know Donna Beadle's work, who writes about low-income learners? It's really, she does wonderful work, and she has a great line, which I'll paraphrase, but essentially, no one who's escaped poverty has ever cited a program, a process, a system, a policy. They always cite a person. And in fact, for almost everyone in this room, the most transformational moments in our lives have been in relationship with someone, usually a teacher or a coach or someone who lifts us up, mentors us, et cetera. But with these innovators, what they're doing is they're centering the human relationship and then thinking about technology as a way of scaling everything else. So when you go into a wonderful company that's doing this with healthcare, and they're working on healthcare coaches, and they actually, so you have to change the reward system, right? What gets paid for, how the money flows. And then you have to think about who drives the relationship. So in their case, a healthcare coach instead of a clinician, right? So the doctor doesn't drive your healthcare any longer. That's a huge change of power. Those are basic, big system designs. And then the technology empowers or fuels that. And I think it's a flipping of the switch of how we often have thought about technology, which is, hey, let's use technology to drive out all of that messy, inefficient human stuff. And we'll solve the problem with technology. And to your point earlier, it's using technology to fuel the human relationship. That's really the critical piece. So when we think about this work, our model is a little different in that we've always been centered on coaching. That's kind of our secret sauce. And now it's the question of, and we have a big $22 million investment with Google to do a new underlying data structure that allows us to get that holistic view in which we will build the app layer on top of that.
I'd love you to kind of compare and contrast, like the Rochester class of 2030 or 2035 graduate, or competency-based graduate of an indeterminate time frame. How does their experience look different from today? And then, what do you need to help get you there?
Well, first of all, we had in Rochester a cyber incident last week that shut down all of our systems and our entire network. And so we were completely technology-less for a week. And I'm happy to say we're getting back up this week. So teachers pulled out the overheads. And stuff like that. So if the purpose of this talk was, has EdTech changed anything? The answer is yes, because we dramatically experienced what it was like without it. I'm not sure I have the 2030 piece, but especially because we're at an EdTech conference, let me just say, I think the pandemic and the investments we all had to make in one-to-one devices and connectivity has brought us to an extraordinary moment of opportunity that may have been in place in some districts, but not at the scale. And all of us now face a cliff as the federal money is gone a year from September to pay for the investments we made. But we now do have the level of access to devices that we really can begin to talk about fundamental changes in the learning process. And I think for those of you in the EdTech sector, to keep in mind that people in chairs like the one I sit in as a superintendent, and there's a million things coming at me all the time, and that's great, it goes with the job. We all have said to ourselves again and again and again, we can't go back to like life before the pandemic. It laid bare too many inequities, too many dysfunctions. But what is the practical path to a different future? I think educational technology is an indispensable part of that practical path, partly because of artificial intelligence, but also just because the pandemic made us put in place the plumbing that is going to be a real opportunity. So I would encourage people in the EdTech sector to be thinking about transformation, because this is a transformational moment. I will say one final point. It is not an effective sales technique to email superintendents cold out of the blue. I get 10 every day. It doesn't work. Stop emailing us.
Divorced from relationships.
Yeah.
Right. So, let's flip this though. and maybe Jamie for you, suppose that we are on this kind of precipice, as Kent says, but the promise is unrealized or not realized nearly to its kind of maximal impact. What went wrong? Like what's sort of over the next 7 years sort of wrong in the sector, wrong amongst the entrepreneurs that kind of fails this moment?
I'll add, when you think about 2030 and what went wrong. So the first piece is this idea around space, so where school occurs and who delivers it, right? And when we think about all the competing forces around, do we have enough teachers? Will we have enough teachers? What is the background of a teacher? If I was a biologist at 3M and now I want to teach, what is the path for me to do that? And so you think about all these possibilities, right, that we can fully realize, and so what will prevent us? I think the first thing is I always go back to policy and policymakers. Yeah. And if we put all of our energy into figuring out how not to versus how, right? So whether it's another national standards movement, we change accountability, we come up with a great idea at the federal or the state level, and we're seeing that happen across the country right now in a lot of varieties. That will continue to be the biggest challenge, in my opinion, to real consistent progress at scale. And so what do we do about that? I think a big part of it is, and a lot of us in this room, whether you are a researcher, a practitioner, an EdTech founder, somebody who's running a scaled EdTech company, like we all have an opportunity to make sure when we educate our policymakers, like they really understand the possibilities of what we can do for kids, because it doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on, like everybody wants to do right for kids, right? It's just how we're gonna get there. So I think about, we've never been able to really get to this ecosystem. The data's a mess, right? You're buying things at the district level, you're buying things at the building level. We're all trying to do the same thing, which is help kids accelerate and learn. And yet none of it talks to each other, right? And it's really challenging to figure out, like, are we doing the right things or not? And so until we start to get this cohesion around a foundation of what we're trying to actually achieve, like what are the goals of using all this learning in EdTech within classrooms, and what are we trying to actually achieve, and then how do we actually influence the agenda and the policies, it's gonna be really, really challenging to do. What we will end up with is what we have today, inequity, right? You will have the suburban districts that have the affluence, the policymakers who are deeply focused on innovation. You will see those kids have all the opportunities in the world, and you will see many communities that will be left without. And so I think it's an opportunity like this. Many of us have been coming to this conference for a long, long time. There's 7,000 people here. Like just that in and of itself is amazing, because some of us were here when it was like 100. And so like here's our opportunity, and we've got to make sure that we're like all pushing in the same direction to get our policymakers to actually listen.
Kristen, how does the equity point play out in higher ed? Because it strikes me, Paul will get there in 2025.
Yeah.
Maybe first or second institution to the grand vision. And thankfully,
got his running shoes on. He's working on it.
Some of these most scaled institutions actually serve some of the students who stand most to benefit from that personalization, that level of coaching. But the sector on the higher ed side is going to have a lot of have-nots. And so how do we get this sort of sparkle dust to kind of sprinkle a little further and help institutions that won't be first across the line or won't even be 100th across the line kind of get there eventually, or do they just kind of fall off because they can't deliver this type of experience?
I think that's a great question, and I'm really both heartened and discouraged by sometimes what I see in terms of institutional policy and change. But I think there's places like SNU, like Georgia State, that are really orienting and focusing on the student and learner experience and removing barriers to enable that. And so in my mind, it's really about, and where I've seen it work so effectively, is where you change policies, right, to incentivize faculty around quality instruction, to give them time to learn and collaborate and work together around, professional learning communities, and how do you put in place, evidence-based teaching practices, and how do you run experiments that sometimes might fail and sometimes may succeed, right? And how do you make that okay, that shared learning? And that's really different than the notion of selectivity, right? Keep out gateway courses that are meant as and have acted as blockers to different groups, right? Disaggregating, the performance of students in those courses and how they're learning, and looking at that as a measure for your teaching, right? Are we seeing that students of color are getting outcomes that are less good than our students who are not of color? Well, how do we fix that? You need to look at the data and disaggregate. To do that, you need to give faculty time, support, incentives, and you need to look systemically, not just at what instructors are doing, but think about how do we, create across the institution that whole learner experience. And that oftentimes really, and how do we use technology to support that at scale? But fundamentally, how do we map and think about that student experience? And I think Georgia State is an institution that I'm sure many of you are aware of that has now launched the National Institute for Student Success that is sharing that more broadly. And so I also think my last point on this is just that collaboration and sharing, less competition and more collaboration around these things, that there's enough, we can all succeed together on this. There's enough work and progress to be done that these should be items that we are collaborating on, not competing on.
Mark, what's sort of best case 2030 for you, and what's Amira doing then?
Yeah, so I think our take on the failure of EdTech starts with the comparison around how technology has been allowed to innovate in education versus in other parts of the world. What we know from the research is that people are absolutely abysmally terrible at getting things right the first time, but that we are incredibly good tinkerers, and that the way we succeed and have impact is through short and constant iterative learning cycles driven by feedback and evidence. And the sad truth is that especially in K-12 education, I won't speak for higher ed because I know nothing about it, but in K-12 education, we've created a system that is incredibly antithetical to short, iterative, evidence-driven feedback loops.
Yeah.
So our hope is that what we're starting to see now is a real honoring of the fact that in order to create systems that bring people and technology together, we have to create governance that allows for constant learning through the careful evaluation of evidence of efficacy.
But could we just probe that a minute? Like, Kent, would you want to make available a school for a mediocre EdTech product in the beginning of a product evolution on a kind of test bed basis?
Listen, if we want to succeed, we need to accept the fact that success is driven by failure, right? This is the essence of science. You run experiments, and some of the experiments fail. And I think this concern that every failure is a disaster leads to the incredibly systemic failure we've seen. We were with the California Department of Ed folks yesterday, and we were looking at the data around reading scores. And what you see is this horrific, almost perfect correlation between the parental socioeconomic status of the folks in a district and kids' reading scores. Right? So our fear of failure is leading to the macro failure that 90% of our black kids are not good readers. Right?
I think my question is a little narrow, and Kent would love your thought. Like, how do you create an environment where you can do that kind of test and learn and the products will get much better without making it a waste for the kids involved?
I think it's discipline and commitment to do it. There's been this interesting work that around improvement science that has started to get some traction. It usually is a separate thing right now, like we're going to have our networked improvement community, as opposed to just the way we do tech, the way we do these things.
Yep.
I mentioned that Rochester is home to the Mayo Clinic, though, and an astonishing global organization. This is how they get up every day.
Yeah, exactly.
They think about, they had the best COVID outcomes in the world in little Rochester, Minnesota, because they are constantly learning and failing fast. One thing I'm thinking about with technology is we are, in our strategic plan next year, going to redesign how we fund and staff our schools, and that's following academic work we're doing this year. I want to have a different way to fund technology. I think funding technology in a tech budget gets in the way of this kind of thinking.
Exactly.
And I want to have a tech-infused curriculum budget, a tech-infused professional development budget, tech-infused student support. And I know I got to take it out of Mike Johnson's budget, who's our tech director, and put it so that it's an enabler of other processes, because that's going to create the capacity to try stuff and fail.
Right.
And if you always have to go to Mike and ask to buy a new app or something like that, he's a great guy, but it's not going to promote that kind of a culture of continuous improvement. So if anybody has any great ideas on how to do that, I'm eager for them.
I'm curious, Kent, like kind of the same question to Paul. Like you're forward thinking, you have these enablers in a great set of local partners and the trust of your community. You know, many superintendents would love to have those conditions, and hopefully they would then be forward thinking. Like, how do you get this to spread beyond the most thoughtful, kind of most organized set of districts, that it's at scale? And policy would help and the right incentives, but what else do we need?
Is that for me again? I agree completely about policy. I think that's huge. Research. I think research that actually shows the efficacy of some of these things. My field of education does have a herd mentality. And suddenly it's like, I'm going to close my door and teach and do whatever I want until I see that something works, and then we're all going to run toward it. But when we just look at what has happened, a couple years ago, it was growth mindset and sort of thinking about that, and it just went everywhere. Right now, it's the science of reading. And there can be problematic things about this, but when you marry good research with good tools and practice, that really gets the attention. And so for people who are going to be getting PhDs and wanting to do ed research, I think really helping us understand the value add for the tech and then get it out there in accessible ways, I think that's going to be a real trigger to get us moving.
So policy and research, maybe Paul, what would you want differently from entrepreneurs and investors? What's the behavior change that accelerates this rather than decelerates?
I don't know. I've been coming to this conference for a while, and I always feel like there's a major theme that sort of dominates for a while. So some years ago it was, oh my God, traditional higher ed is the dinosaur, and EdTech's going to put it out of business. It's like, well, actually it was a little more resilient than that. Then it became, well, higher ed's not really good at workforce, so all the sessions are about workforce. And today it seems like everyone's crowding into sessions around AI. I do think we have this much more fundamental question that I've been wrestling with since December 1st when I started playing with ChatGPT, which is, I think we are now entering into a fundamental paradigmatic shift, and these questions are all sort of open again. And I was just talking to George Seaman this morning, who I think is just our best thinker in education and AI, and George was saying, higher ed's been built, education has been built on epistemology, on what you know, and now knowledge is no longer scarce. Knowledge is one prompt away in your phone. So he's been arguing, you've been following George, that now we have to move to the ontological. How will you be? And how will you be is a question that gets taken up in religion and philosophy departments, not in business departments, not in technology departments. And so if you follow that train of thought, then what are the solutions we're going to need? And if you haven't read Power and Prediction, my favorite book of the last month, it's a great book, it would argue that when electricity was invented, you didn't see the value and potential of it unleashed until it became part of a system redesign. When it was a point solution, it was pretty cool. Like, oh, my washing machine now is powered by electricity. That's great. But it wasn't until you looked at, like, how could you redesign a factory where you don't have to be tied to the spindle driven by the steam or the water wheel below, that you could fundamentally redesign assemblies, and Henry Ford could invent the modern assembly line. So I think we're at that moment, right? Like, when we think about system redesign today, we are going to need not point solutions. So a lot of when we come to a conference like this, everyone's got a little point solution. And it's great, but it's like grit in the gears. Trying to insert point solutions into a big machine at scale is really hard. It's almost harder. Like, people think, oh, SNHU, you're very large, you have 185,000 students, it should be easy to do this. It's actually harder to do it. Like, the machine isn't built for small things. But I think what we will need to do, and then this is the dialogue or the conversation with entrepreneurs and investors, is we're going to need to do the clay Kristen's in play, right? We're going to need to separate out in a skunkworks-like fashion a team that sets and looks at the three legs of redesign for institutions of higher education. So that's going to be, how do we rethink learning? When we are at fundamental questions of what is knowledge, how do you rethink student experience and support, all the human relational stuff? And then how do you rethink business operations? And at our place, like everyone here, everyone's playing with it. But those are all, like, we need to step back and open the aperture. So I don't know how to answer your question at this moment. Like, I want better questions right now.
Better question.
Not from you. That sounded terrible. I want us to ask better questions of ourselves. That's what I meant.
Yeah, yeah.
If you can do better questions, that's cool too. I mean.
Better questions.
Or for Jake, yeah.
Like, maybe, Jamie, sort of just on a similar wave,
Yeah.
If we've sort of democratized knowledge and we're moving to the ontological, point solutions are tricky, not always useful. It's actually harder to kind of curate them in all but the highest capacity districts or higher ed institutions. Like, what would you want differently of yourself? What would you want differently of your current or future investors? Like, how does the mindset need to change? Supposing we can get the policy, which is a big supposition, like, how does that behavior change? Because it does strike me some of the failures we're describing are failures of kind of the entrepreneurs and their orientation to real problems, and then that's driven by their investors.
I don't like that question. I'm kidding. No.
Your current investors are lovely, but others that you've met along the way.
Yes. I think I'll talk about it from the perspective of building these tools and then from the perspective of investing in them. And I think for both, this idea around, like, we call it at Edmentum co-opetition. So it's this idea of, like, in the best interest of kids, teachers, administrators, and the system, we have to figure out a way to get the tools to work together. So whether it's like ours, which is a very large portfolio, or it's point solutions, like, we're constantly looking for partners who have the best interest of kids in mind. And, like, if you are a startup or you're building something, you should be thinking about that, because the problem that we're trying to solve, right, is we're trying to help all kids learn and learn well. And if we create things that we're not envisioning how it's going to roll into some sort of unified opportunity for kids and teachers to make it easier for teachers to use and make it really meaningful and impactful for kids, we are doing an injustice to this system, right? And so this idea around, like, how we work better together, you can still compete, you can still differentiate, there's a million different ways you can do that. And so we have quite a few, at Edmentum, we have quite a few competitors that we actually partner with, and it's for that very purpose. And from an investor perspective, you should be thinking about the same thing. And you should also understand that when you're funding all these great ideas that you think are going to change the world, and hopefully maybe some of them do, you should also understand the system that you're selling into, right? And the expectations of the system. Mm-hmm. And there are so many new investors coming into education. A lot of it, we were talking about the first wave of VC and private equity, a little more than a decade ago, and, like, what that actually did in terms of just opportunity and access to all these different tools and things that you can purchase now. And now there's this whole new wave of investors coming in, and it's almost the same conversation. Mark can attest this too, because he's been very active. Like, this idea of, like, this one thing is going to, like, fundamentally change all of education. It's not going to replace the human connection. It is not going to take away all of the system obligations that we have. It is not going to change policy. So, like, understanding that and then, like, trying to work towards this common goal, I think, is really, really important. So,
Kent, maybe I'll give you the last word. What are you hopeful for? What in all of this is sort of exciting but also probable to you?
I'm hopeful that we can begin to see holistic, so not just test scores, improvement for our kids growing up in marginalized communities for whom sustained progress at scale has been elusive for a long time. I hope that is not just academic, it's also social and emotional. And I think the fact, it's interesting because you said the theme here has kind of been AI, and as somebody who doesn't live in this world, I've picked that up as well. I've been encouraged that a somewhat less prominent theme has been equity. and that when we talk about technology as an enabler of social justice
Yes.
through the lens of education, that's a different discussion than what I've heard pre-pandemic. And so that makes me hopeful that some of the smartest minds in the world are thinking about how technology can enable our kids who face the greatest challenges, and whose challenges are going to be further increased by the advent of ChatGPT and other algorithms that can take away jobs.
Well, I guess I'm also hopeful that the 5 of you are working on this, and thankful that we could be on the panel together. And maybe if the audience would join me in thanking our 5 panelists.